Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the AIIM Growth Partners podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Iwan, the CEO and founder of Bastion. Iwan's grown and built a revolutionary business in the cybersecurity space. I'm excited to kind of unpack how he's standing out in this crowded market and the real world problems he's solving. But let me hand over to you first of all, Iwan, and introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your kind of background to the listeners, please.
Yeah. Hello everyone, I'm Iwan. I'm the current CTO of Bastion. We essentially establish trust for digital connections, whether it be in a manufacturing setting or banking setting or anything like that. Bastion at its core is a new protocol that I developed around 5 years ago when I was still busy with FinTech applications. At its heart, it does identity management for every single data packet going in and out and encrypts it with a unique key. All of that makes it you can tackle a wide array of use cases with it. One being secure access for critical infrastructure, another being data security for AI data flows into a factory, and C3 command control communications and all of that. So yeah, that's essentially my short background with Bastion. And I'll hand over to David again and we can dive into some topics.
Yeah, amazing. Before we kind of dive more into the business and kind of really flesh out, what we're doing and the problems you're solving, take me back to your experience within the FinTech and what ultimately led you to realizing that there was this need and you needed to, the existing protocols in place weren't maybe sufficient. Talk me through that kind of epiphany, please.
So that's actually an interesting and mildly hilarious story. So this was back in the Web3 days. So when Web3 was still at the forefront of everyone's minds, we had this big idea to essentially do a digital couponing system where you could redeem and issue digital coupons, but you can go and redeem them in store with various retailers. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of different retailers interacting with the coupon, lots of different users. So this ultimately creates some very big security woes. And we were in the midst of piloting it, reaching out to users and saying, and to retailers specifically, and saying, hey, we've got this amazing concept, you can add X amount to your bottom line every year with it, but then the security implications came up, and believe it or not, the retailers there were scared the guys at Google, of all places, were going to sit there and steal their coupons. So we had to build an end-to-end security system for these coupons, and that was the early origins of Bastion. It's a protocol to secure data, hence it could secure coupons. So at scale, no other solution could basically meet our needs. That was a big issue. Beyond just that, you sit with your regular security implications, so your encryption, your privacy implications. So GDPR was a big thing back then. It was just coming into the fray. In South Africa, we had the POPI Act, which is essentially a mirror copy. So regulational issues, scale issues, all of that was a big problem. So we couldn't make do with it. So we had to invent something new.
So it sounds like Bastion was kind of born out of, building this initial product and realizing that the kind of protocols that existed, weren't sufficient from a security perspective for this product you were building. Is that right?
Yeah. So it didn't meet the security requirements. The scale was another big issue. So ultimately what we had to do was develop this product, and then, we weren't kind of piloting it to everyone again, but back then, we immediately saw the application of this for OT security scenarios. So things like secure access, securing a PLC remotely, securing one of those nice robotic arms remotely and stuff like that. That's stuff that Bastion does very well, as ultimately it creates digital provenance for something, whether it's a coupon or a data packet. It's the same concept. So, we could do that.
Why the focus specifically on critical infrastructure? Was it purely the COO's kind of expertise in the OT domain, or were there kind of other components and elements there as well that made you specifically choose to focus there?
So that's kind of dual-sided. So one obviously being his expertise in the matter. So there is a bit of a market gap. He's highlighted it. And so, okay, we decided to go for it. The other is ultimately, as a security company, we want to provide some value to civilization too. And I think OT specifically is something that's very underutilized or very undersecured at this point, actually. It's what keeps the lights on. It's a worthy cause to grow into.
I think it's such an interesting space, the OT space. The real world impacts of, a breach in an OT environment is so much greater.
Yeah. So, it depends. Like if a bank gets hit too, it's also very bad. But, OT is one of the scenarios where cybersecurity does have life and death consequences. So it is a interesting field to work in.
And you mentioned, I think typically if we look at the manufacturing space and we're looking at a lot of these OT environments, I think one of the things that's quite typical of these environments is that operating old kind of legacy systems, a lot of the equipment is so incredibly old, yet it seems like there's more and more digitalization. So what are the biggest trends you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting topic. So over here, digitization, especially in Europe, it's commonly referred to as Industry 5 at this point. So it's the enhancement of operational flows with advanced technologies like AI, digital twins, and stuff like that. But with the core aspect of bringing humans back into the loop. So I think it's a very good concept. Over on the United States, they're still very much focused on Industry 4, which is purely bringing in AI and digital twins, etc., into the loop. So not as human-centric. It's interesting to bring that up ultimately because it does have security implications. So I'm sure you're well acquainted with the false positives that AI give and stuff like that. It's they are quite notorious for that. Industry 5 solves that to a degree, so you have human oversight back into the loop again, so which prevents, AI just hallucinating stuff and coming up with false positives, which does have severe implications. So yeah, that's kind of where we're seeing with the digitization aspects, and obviously the security is ultimately a big problem with that too. Many factories still have air gaps, so they do not even want to be accessible online, or at their heart they want to be air gap. But that's another story where you actually go into a factory and you realize there's people taking cell phones into the place, they have Wi-Fi going and stuff. It's a wished for air gap that no longer exists.
I think it's really interesting kind of the difference between, and we'll kind of dive into it a little bit more, but the 4.0 versus the 5.0 and, talking about that human-centered approach.
Exactly, yeah. The best example to give about this is actually what our CFO came up with, and it's like, I'm sure everyone is using ChatGPT to an extent nowadays, but sometimes get the most horrific content on LinkedIn or messages, and it's just somebody who copy paste it's a thing from AI, or they created an AI agent that just spams out this AI generated spam, and it's really off the mark sometimes. Now imagine putting that technology into a factory. It might make processes more efficient 80% of the time, but you're still going to sit with that 20% or 10% or even less sometimes. But there it's catastrophic if something bad happens. So in other essence, Industry 5 is a lot better because at least you have that human oversight there. And it's better in more ways than one, because one expensive thing about AI is computing resources. Everyone knows about the chip wars going on, and you need bigger GPUs, bigger computers, everything. One reason for that is because you have to take into account edge cases always. Whereas Industry 5, humans mitigate a lot of your edge cases. So it's a much more efficient model too, not just safer.
Interesting. And I think you touched on briefly kind of the whole idea of hallucinations. We could probably have a separate episode on that. I think it's something that sort of cropped up on so many podcasts recently. But what, I guess, we've spoken about the trends and the drive towards digitalization, talking about geographically. Some countries are focused more on 4.0, others on kind of 5.0, and the pros and cons of both. What are the kind of the biggest trends you're seeing from your perspective as they kind of pertain to sort of security of these environments?
Okay, so that's also a very good question. And that has to do with the more economic landscape of everything that we do. So Industry 4.0 is still much more prevalent in the United States, whereas 5.0 has been taken over in Europe or adopted in Europe. But as a result, you see most of your security companies still being focused on Industry 4.0 security stuff. So they are very much focused just on securing AI data pipes and maybe even deploying your AI server in the factory directly so that you don't even have remote data communication issues. Others, like predictive maintenance guys, purely just use 5G or something like that. So you kind of have different security stuff. Whereas if you go to Industry 5.0, you do have a little bit more of a nuanced security case, because now there's actively a human that has to be in the loop somewhere, whether you have them on the shop floor actively just looking whether the machines are behaving correctly, or whether you decide to give them a computer to override the AI, or do something alongside it. Maybe it's like a remote controlled crane or something like that. That obviously does come with its own unique cyber challenges now, because if you sit with any moving component, it is very, very dangerous to do that remotely with data connectivity, because somebody could actively hack that and maybe just make wreak havoc in the factory floor. There are some very interesting startups that are piloting like remote controlled and AI driven machinery for mines and stuff like that. So those big excavators and big cranes and whatnot, they are remotely operated. I'm not so sure how I feel about the security about their models just now. So what they actually do is they deploy a kind of a Wi-Fi mesh on the site. So, they physically deploy a computer every, I think, 100 meters or 200 meters or something odd, and just physically have your communications relay between the nodes into your actual machine. The problem is you do not know what a naughty 16-year-old armed with a laptop can do if they get access to your mine or your factory or something like that. So that is kind of a very unique security challenge, but it's something that I'm quite excited about because I believe that Bastion solves that at this point at the moment. So
whether staying with that kind of use case specifically or kind of looking at it more from a kind of holistic standpoint, with all this drive towards kind of increased digitalization, secure remote access, and this general kind of industry trend towards digitalization, what gap does that leave Bastion? And I guess from that, what's the real world kind of problem you're solving for these businesses and clients?
It's kind of a multifaceted question now, but we were on Industry 5.0 again, so I'll go ahead and tackle it from that front first. So Industry 4.0 is pretty much mitigatable via your standard means that you see in the United States. Bastion uniquely is something that's much more stronger suited for Industry 5, especially when you get in with your remote control communications. So very much your C3 kind of stuff, command control communication. Current cyber measures are kind of ill-equipped for that because, you sit with session tokens. There's tons of YouTube videos on there how to exploit a session, steal a cookie or something like that, and then you basically exploit the end. Very dangerous to do in a factory. So something unique that Bastion does is that we encrypt every single data packet essentially with its unique key. This makes all of your man-in-the-middle and session-based attacks null and void essentially. So it's a much stronger suite for your remote control of your aspects, which is something that you're going to see again in Industry 5. Now, specifically, why is Industry 5 important versus Industry 4, which the Americans use? The thing that happened is that the European Union has physically codified Industry 5.0. So it's one of the few instances where new frontier of technology has already been codified in Europe. Now, why is that specifically important? Well, 80%, maybe 60% of your big automation factory automation companies like ABB, Schneider, all of them sit in Europe. So all of your big players are here. Germany is over here, which is also a big manufacturer internationally. So, it's a very big front, and they've already propagated and are starting to push Industry 5. So there's kind of a dissonance, over in the United States who keeps on going with Industry 4 versus Industry 5, which everyone is already on over here. So, it's interesting, but yeah, remote control communications is an issue. Bastion does that uniquely. Industry 4 versus 5, it's a little bit of politics, but ultimately 5 is better for the aspects that I mentioned earlier. You have cheaper computing. It's also more efficient and safer. So yeah.
I think that's a particularly interesting insight, what you were saying there, that the US is kind of lagging behind in some ways. Not to directly kind of quote you, but, lagging behind in the sense that they're kind of using the 4.0 rather than 5.0. Why do you think that is? And why do you think the EU is kind of investing more? You did mention that 60% plus maybe of the manufacturers and automation companies are based in Europe. But what are the kind of key reasons you think that Europe's taking it more seriously and more progressive in this area?
So that's an interesting question again. So honestly, I do not know whether that came from a moral implication, which it most likely did. The EU was scared of the jobs, essentially. So, they didn't want their workforce to be replaced by AI. However, that actually, or incidentally, became a very insightful thing to do for the reason that I mentioned earlier. AI is very expensive. It has a ton of edge cases. False positives are an issue. Ironically, humans solve that very well. So Industry 5.0 is a very good model to aspire to. Now, why we still see Industry 4 in the United States, once again, is multifaceted. So tons of VC money went to Industry 4.0 startups. So literally millions and hundreds of millions. So they're not going to be very keen to say, okay, we were wrong, it's Industry 5. You have a lot of influencers there who spent the last 15 years almost building up their entire online reputation around Industry 4.0. Now all of a sudden you're not the Industry 4.0 guy anymore. You're Industry 5. So it's a personal branding issue, money, and then also, like I mentioned or briefly touted earlier, a lot of your current cyber vendors are better equipped for Industry 4 versus 5. Just a general lack of wanting to switch over to 5. I think the Americans would much rather just have been kept Industry 4, but recodified. Okay, humans should be centric to it, but it's always expensive to rebrand. So that's kind of why we're seeing the dissonance, I think.
One of the things you mentioned earlier that I wanted to kind of pick up on, you mentioned off air, so that's why I kind of wanted to tee you up for this. You mentioned that encryption piece and how you help, these kind of OT operators in these businesses improve their security through encryption. There's a lot of talk in the news, I think probably because of Jensen Huang and other people, around, quantum computing and, when are we going to achieve, when are these algorithms going to be broken? And there's a big shift and a big kind of trend towards post-quantum cryptography and post-quantum security. I think you've mentioned off air that you're already kind of post-quantum ready. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So it ties in nicely with what we said earlier. Tech is very hype driven. It's Industry 4, now it's Industry 5, and now it's quantum, AI, and everything. So the problem is that quantum computers are a very real thing. They are demonstratable units. Google has some, IBM has some, etc. Very small at this stage still. I do not know whether it is actually feasible for them to scale it to a full-blown 10,000 bit qubit quant, which I think that you need, or is it 10 million? I don't know. It's a 10 with a lot of zeros. I can't remember. But essentially, you need a very big quantum computer to actively break RSA, your public key encryption stuff, with Shor's algorithm. So that's kind of where the scare comes from in cybersecurity. Basically all of your current cyber vendors and cyber solution stuff use public key cryptography in some way or form, whether it's RSA, ECC, what have you. So Shor's makes it possible to take those algorithms that would take trillions of years to break, hundreds of trillions of years to crack, and do it in about 8 hours. So obviously this is a big issue for data security. The kind of dualistic aspect of it is that it is very difficult to achieve sufficient scale with a quantum computer. A lot of engineering and innovation is still going to have to go into scaling them. Something that is more interesting is that if you can essentially utilize them in like a Beowulf cluster, which is almost a good example of that is actually Bitcoin mining is almost a similar thing. So you have a bunch of computers working together essentially to crack encryption. So it could be via a lottery system like you have with crypto mining, or it could be a shared resource or a shared compute approach to basically crack your encryption key. So instead of one 10,000 qubit machine or one 10 million qubit machine, we essentially distribute it around 10 machines, and each only have 1 million qubits, or less, 100,000, even a million. So those quants already exist. They're big enough to do that. Somebody just hasn't done a cluster like that yet. Honestly, I do not know whether the cluster or the Beowulf approach is feasible for this kind of thing. It's just an interesting speculation that I might have. But the more urgent issue with quantum computing, and this was what we covered last time, is that you have your harvest now, decrypt later attack vector. So quantum computers might only be feasibly large enough to break encryption 10 years, 20 years from now, but you have a lot of secrets that still need to remain secret 10 years, 20 years from now. So things like health records, some scrupulous bank expenses and stuff like that. Some things that politicians deal with, so for them, this is already a very big issue. So they already need to look at migrating to post-quantum stuff. So yeah, it's still a far off issue, but it is tangible for some at the moment.
It sounds like you've been very intentional in kind of building your business. So just over 2 years ago, you set up Bastion. I think officially you've been very intentional. You've mentioned a number of times kind of hype, and you've not jumped on this sort of bandwagon, riding the waves and kind of jumping on these hype cycles. You've been very intentional about building a business for the future. We talked about specifically gearing towards Industry 5.0 and also, the post-quantum sort of readiness. So what is the vision kind of longer term for the business then?
To be fair so we do also try and utilize a little bit of the hype now and then. So obviously we do have Quantum Secure ready for Bastion already in our messaging. We issue a new AES key for every data packet, etc. We also do use a little bit of AI, but when we started, we initially led heavily with those buzzwords. I just realized there's a bit of a oversaturation of those going on in the market at this point. So it's much more or better to focus on your holistic long-term view of what you actually want to build. And essentially for that, with Bastion is I want to create a company that establishes digital trust. So this goes counterintuitively with your stuff that you see about zero trust and everything. But, I want to create stuff that people can trust. So if you interact with a computer that's secured with Bastion, it's the same as that you have an Intel Inside sticker. I want you to feel safe. That's kind of my ultimate vision for the company, which is a lot more holistic, but I don't see a lot of value in riding on the buzzword bandwagon.
And what and when was the turning point for you when you kind of realized that?
This ties in again with the VC aspect of everything. So I think a lot of startups get this wrong because your pitch to a VC is vastly different to your pitch to an end user or somebody you're trying to sell your technology to. It's kind of difficult because, there are some aspects, I'm in B2B now, so for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to focus in on B2B now. There are various different silos in B2B sales, so meaning that there's security, which is much more like insurance. It's much more conservative. It's a lot slower to sell stuff, but you have a bit more stickiness there at least. Versus, you have your go-to-market teams, your marketing teams, your sales teams, and all of the other aspects. They are a lot more willing to try hypey stuff because it's a low cost to adopt, or there's not a lot of risk for them just to use a burner email account and just try it. Our current marketing guy will likely try 10 new tools whenever they email him. So, it's a low cost. There's buzzwords do tend to work, I think. So if you use AI, machine learning, Web3 stuff. It's all interesting. It sounds interesting. It sounds a little bit better than what they were using. So let's try it. Security, unfortunately, we do not have that luxury. So they won't just try stuff for the sake of trying it. So you really need to have a very good pitch and presentation and make sure that they understand what the technology is and exactly what the benefits are, how you're different to them and stuff. Honestly, I still struggle with that a little bit. I tend to go too technical when I describe stuff to people still. I can't help it. I developed the stuff, so it's hard for me not to get excited about it. But yeah, essentially it's just not using buzzwords, but just focusing on the end business outcomes and then obviously your technical differentiations once you get to that level of discussion.
I think it's really interesting what you talked about and the direct kind of contradiction between the zero trust kind of architectures and, building digital trust. Why do you think that digital trust is especially important within cybersecurity?
Wow. So this call is actually getting quite philosophical. Zero trust is an interesting concept, and this is going to tie in a bit later when we go into identity management now. But, it's a very interesting name thing, but I do not know how accurate the description or how well thought out the term was actually, because, it sounds like you're not trusting anything now when you say zero trust, but that's not really the case. You're asking someone to verify their identity and you're doing so continuously, which is the core essence of zero trust. But you still have to trust the person who logs into your system that they're not going to cause harm. You have to trust that they're not a, I don't know, North Korean agent or something and, just break your factory and stuff like that. So that's kind of where the more philosophical implications of zero trust come in. Whereas with Bastion, I'm trying to establish trust. I'm trying to make, okay, you can trust this computer that logs into your system remotely. So it's completely secured. We still take zero trust very much at heart. So every single data packet that comes in is encrypted uniquely and identified uniquely. So this is way, way, way more robust than what you see other vendors doing. But it's, I still don't really like the term zero trust that much because, you still have to trust the human who's actually logging in with said computer. We are even building a little bit of application in features in around that to basically stop coercion-based attacks and stuff like that via picking up your camera, making sure that you're in a good mental state and everything. But, ultimately, I still don't know how I feel about the term versus I think it's much better just to market, what if you employ this, you can trust the computer logging in because we handle all the zero trust stuff for you. You don't have to worry about that. So it's all packaging and framing stuff and whatnot, which is surprisingly hard in tech. So
Really interesting what you were saying there about trying to understand people's kind of mental states and, using things like cameras. Can we look in at that for a little second and focusing on that specifically, what you're doing around
sure,
that?
sure. I on a kind of a non sequitur, I author some short stories, specifically for cyber stuff. So and this actually came to me a couple of months ago. I authored this one story, and it was a very good one. It's about this guy who essentially does MSP work for a factory. He ends up getting kidnapped, and it's like the entire premise of the story is, you don't even need a multi-million-dollar quantum computer or computer network or whatever to break encryption keys to log into the factory. You just kidnap the human and you force him to log in. So, it's a $5 wrench. So as somebody adequately pointed out in my LinkedIn comments, such an attack is known as a rubber hose attack. So that's quite hilarious if you think about it, but quite dark too. And I realized that there's no way for current cyber measures actually to guard against that. We all focus so heavily on securing the access for the computer, but we never make sure that the human is actually not being extorted, not being forced to log in by gunpoint and stuff like that. I'm originally from South Africa, which I'm sure, as everyone knows now due to the news and stuff, is quite a dangerous place. So, I have firsthand family experiences and friends experience that. It's something that's constantly in the forefront of your mind, and it might not be an issue now for most people listening to this, but for some industries, if you're looking at nuclear power plants and stuff like that, this is a very big issue. Some factories that do manufacture stuff for the Department of Defense and stuff like that, it's also a very tangible issue. It's not something that a lot of people think about. I think they don't really want to think about it because it pinpoints acutely the weaknesses in your current cyber posture, but it's a very dark topic to go into. But as a cyber vendor, that is ultimately my job to do. So what we're doing is doing an AI-based approach that takes real-time feed from your camera like we're doing now, but it does a little bit of facial tracking, voice tracking, make sure that, first of all, that nobody else is in the camera screen, so that if somebody is standing next to me, that's already a red flag. So that should not be happening in a regular operational flow. Then it might prompt you and say, hey, we noticed there's an extra person there. Can you respond to the following sentence and we can make sure that you're in calm state? So if it picks up that you're nervous then or something like that, ultimately it would happen sequentially and then it just cut off access completely. So it would prevent someone from extorting you and logging in remotely to the factory or, uploading malware to your computer so that you can distribute it to your downstream network.
I had a guest on the podcast recently who was talking about voice biometrics, and I thought it was fascinating to kind of learn about how many data points you can get with voice biometrics versus, facial and some of the other forms of identification. It was really interesting what he was sort of saying to me, that the ability to use sort of phonemes and understand phoneme frequency to sort of understand any sort of differences in intonation. You mentioned there, if someone's under high levels of stress or duress or whatever, if they're being coerced, that can actually be, much more easily detected than with other forms of identification. So I think that's an incredible sort of use case or application of this sort of technology to really kind of mitigate against this kind of human risk, which is such an served area, apart from awareness training and stuff like that, which is limited results at best. It's interesting how technology can be used to sort of plug this gap.
Yeah, it is. Being in the EU now, it's great that I have the Industry 5 stuff going for me, but on the other aspect, I do have our GDPR laws and our privacy laws now, so it's not a very kosher thing to log computer activity via webcam 24. So, I can already hear people screaming in the background, privacy laws and everything. So that's a big issue that we have to tackle. And essentially how we're doing that is with on-device processing. So we try and keep the processing of all data and AI and stuff on your device locally as much as possible to basically circumvent that. But, it's an interesting topic because this does affect a lot of cyber vendors. There are some doing deep fake AI tracking and making sure that you're an actual person sitting behind the webcam remotely and stuff. I don't know how they're going to pass their privacy stuff once it starts getting to that level, though. So it's another interesting front to look at too going into the future.
Absolutely. No, appreciate you kind of bringing that up. That's definitely one to kind of ask future guests. But I guess without kind of veering or getting too distracted on this sort of other topic, turning attention to kind of identity management, critical topic we've discussed off air, identity management specifically within the context with the framework of zero trust architectures. Talk us around the importance of effective identity management.
Yeah, now this is going to get a bit heated for the actual practitioners out there. But, if you look at your core, zero trust is essentially just identity management. Whom is accessing what? Are they allowed to? And you just do it continuously. That's the core essence of zero trust. AKA identity management. It's just identity management is not as sexy a term as zero trust, likely for a lot of reasons you pinpointed earlier. It's easier to sell zero trust, it's easier to grasp, etc. But, unfortunately, the end result is it is kind of like you have to take an existing concept and repackage it, and then you sell it, and then it's successful in the cyber market, which I find kind of, I don't know how I feel about that sometimes, but yeah, unfortunately, it's what it is. Regarding identity management, that is essentially what zero trust is. It's just good identity management. Once again, turning to a more philosophical stance, some in our company go as far as to say that once you have identity management perfected, cybersecurity is not an issue anymore. Now, we do get a lot of flack for that on LinkedIn. People would chime in, but what about my SEIM? What about denial of service? What about this? I'm not speaking of this in a practical sense. I'm purely approaching this in a philosophical sense. If you get identity management perfect, cybersecurity won't be an issue. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at something like a denial of service attack, in order for a denial of service attack to be successful, ultimately you're sending random data to a computer somewhere, it's taking up computing resources, and you just swamp it, right? What if we can block the said computer from doing that in the first place? And how you would do that is with identity management. I'm not saying it's possible. I'm just saying if it was perfect, or if we could execute it perfectly given our current technologies, then it wouldn't be an issue. The same with SEIM. I mean, if we could get identity management perfect, there wouldn't really be a need for it. You wouldn't need your endpoint detection response, all of your bells and whistles and stuff, because they wouldn't get access. Same even goes for your phishing stuff. I mean, if identity management were perfect, phishing wouldn't be an issue, because I would be absolutely certain that the email that I received from this person is legitimate, and it's legitimate content in the email. It's safe to click on the link. Is it possible to do this? No. If it were we could get it perfect, yes, and it would be very possible. Now, why is it important to bring that up? Because ultimately that is what we all should aspire to still, even if it's not perfect to the utmost degree. That doesn't stop one, or should not stop one, from seeking excellence, and excellence in your cyber posture would essentially be good identity management. So this prevents stuff. This ultimately reduces cost, because you do not need 100 different tools anymore if you could just get your prevention right. So that's kind of what my take is on the entire sector surrounding that. We have to rebrand stuff, sell it as zero trust, whereas it's essentially it's just good identity management, really. People overinvest, I think, personally, into all of these different tools and stuff that solve niche use cases, but their actual cyber defense is still porous because they have weak identity management. So it's an issue. Not everyone can achieve good identity management. That's also an issue, but nothing stops you from segmenting a hypercritical aspect of your business. Maybe it's a specific server in your business, or it's a PLC if you're a factory or something like that. It is possible actually just to hook up a very strong VPN or secure access management tool, even Bastion, to it. And then you can start sequentially and just at least isolate the stuff that can be damaged or can cause you a lot of damage if they were breached. So that's kind of where identity management comes in. It's not necessarily something like Okta that everyone conceives once you hear it. That meaning that I have a bunch of users logging in remotely and MFA and whatnot. It can even be something as simple as a secure VPN deployment over a jump box. I'm just making sure that whatever device accesses the downstream device is legitimate. It's the correct entity that's connecting to it, and the data that it's sending is correct via AES, GCM, or something like that. Yeah, it's multifaceted. Long way of saying that essentially I think zero trust is a little bit overblown, purely for the fact that it just rebranded good identity management. So yeah, as you can surmise, I'm very pro identity management.
Yeah, absolutely. And you gave such a comprehensive overview of it and such a compelling case for taking it more seriously. And I think just looking back at my time kind of in recruitment, I think it's quite interesting looking at that shift where you got me thinking back to some of the kind of big managed services I was working with where they're all crying out for identity access management engineers, and then all of a sudden it stopped. And then they was looking for security architects with zero trust network, ZTNA security architects. And it's funny, following that theme or following that shift that you mentioned, in keeping with the times and that shift from, identity access management to zero trust. It's funny the repercussions that had on kind of the talent landscape and the requirements, of people. Now, you've mentioned, and as I said, put a quite compelling case together of like the importance of good identity management. I guess if we're looking at it, explicitly, what are the risks and the consequences of not taking identity management seriously?
Well, first and foremost, like I just started earlier, if you do not have good identity management, you do not have good zero trust. You do not even have zero trust. So, it's very much without it, you do not even have an effective cyber posture, really. So once again, identity management isn't necessarily Okta or anything like that. It's anything that just verifies identity and makes secures access to stuff. Whether it's password-based, multi-factor authentication, what have you, it's all a form of identity management. Specifically, the risks that you would see from not having good identity and access management is that you would not have a cyber posture at all to begin with. So you might have your endpoint detection response or your AV software, let's be purely in a small business use case. So a lot of small businesses obviously have their antivirus, whether it be Kaspersky or Norton or what have you. But first and foremost, they have a form of identity management. They have a password that the guy signs in with whenever he switches on his computer. Now, obviously, if you do not have that at all, it's very bad because somebody could remotely log into your computer. They could access your bank accounts. They could do some very bad stuff without even some basic identity management in place. Now, this is interesting to bring up because ironically, you do see a lot of factories out there that do not have the same idea around identity management. So you see a ton of PLCs. If you use something like Shodan or something, you can still see hundreds of PLCs that are on the open internet. They might be protected by a password. Sometimes it's even a default one that the unit shipped with, admin123. So it's not very good. And ultimately, without identity management, you just have a huge gaping hole in your defense. So it doesn't matter what SEIM you have or what antivirus you have, you are going to suffer harm. Versus good identity management, at least you keep them out. At that sense, you can rather forego your antivirus and stuff like that because at least, they're not getting in the first place with. It's still better to have your antivirus, but, if you were to choose one or the other, you should definitely go with your preventative measures first.
So really, I guess we're kind of summarizing that, encapsulating that, or if I can kind of summarize what you said there, sounds like good identity management's not just, that kind of umbrella protection that helps and makes maybe some other tools kind of redundant, but it also shifts security into a more proactive state of mind and state of operation rather than being entirely reactive. Do you think that would be fair to say?
Exactly, yeah. So that's essentially the core case of it. We can briefly mention this now. So I actually interacted with a very good discussion the other day on LinkedIn. So I kind of highlighted why identity management is more important than your detection and response-based stuff. So one interesting thing that pops up is your insurance aspect. So somebody made the argument that you can actually forego all of your current cyber measures because it's just too expensive and just get cyber insurance. That's actually a very valid argument to make, and that's the only one that's probably more reasonable. Okay, do not do identity management at all. But, the issue is that you are seeing a lot of big cyber insurers becoming increasingly hesitant to issue cyber insurance, actually, places like Munich Re and those big insurance shops. So that's an issue. But yeah, ultimately, identity management is what a good cyber posture should be built around. It shouldn't be, a secondary or a tertiary thing that you look at into to do. I think a big issue for this is because it does often get misconstrued mentally. If you mention to any guy in cyber now, what comes to mind when you say identity management? They say Okta or they'll say Entra or something like that, which is not the case. Even just the password that you enter into your laptop is a form of identity management. So yeah, once again, a more philosophical twist to our discussion.
No, interesting. I love it. And I wanted to turn attention to, the business. So you've been going for 2.5 years. You've had some sort of success, as we've discussed off air, in some maybe kind of areas you weren't expecting it, where you've kind of won out on deals and won clients against stiff sort of competition. the market is incredibly crowded and there's a lot of people kind of competing for attention, riding these kind of hype waves and cycles, using these keywords and buzzwords. So I guess my kind of long-winded kind of question is, talk to me around some of the kind of the successes you've had and what you've learned along the way so far through pivoting and innovating and iterating your messaging.
Okay, interesting start. So how we got into OT was via Eric, who said, okay, you know what, this is an interesting aspect to explore. We're still very new in the sense that even though that we're a 2-year-old startup, 2 and 4-month-old startup, we are fairly new still in the private sector. The reason being is that a year ago, we decided, okay, you know, let's try and get the message out there. This is what we're building and stuff. So we ended up applying for a Military Innovation Award. So that we ended up winning, as I told you last time. So yeah, we're very deep into the military sector currently in the EU. So we're doing projects with them. It's very interesting stuff. But you know, that was kind of a case of serendipity, like I mentioned last time. So we did not expect to win when we applied. Sounds bad because you're supposed to be super confident about your technology and everything. But, you know, it was a very happy occasion for us, for serendipitous. So we ended up getting traction there, doing projects for militaries now, which it's interesting. So cyber, you mentioned earlier, it's very saturated, very difficult. And that's very true. I see the same even now with our own stuff. It's ironically easier for me to work with militaries and stuff than what it is to actually propagate our technology in the private sector or evangelize it. The reason being it's just so congested. There's so much noise out there. It's this buzzword and that buzzword versus the military is much more technical in a sense. So they kind of, okay, what can the stuff do? Okay, we can use it for C3, you know, command control communications, or we can build a quantum mesh with it or something like that. It's all very technical stuff, and that kind of excites them again versus, you know, in the private sector, now you have to find a very neat way of encapsulating all of that and making it easy to understand. Hence zero trust earlier, which you adequately put, you know, it's easy to conceptualize for people. So, you know, now it's kind of your packaging on the one sense. It's the exact same technology, but in the private sector, you have to spend a lot of time and effort into how you package stuff, how you phrase it, how your messaging around it goes, versus the military stuff. All that you really need is just a good presentation and a white paper. So, you know, that's it.
So with this sort of finding and the serendipities you mentioned, getting so entrenched and so embedded within the kind of the military space, looking ahead for the business then, do you think, you know, the focus is going to be really kind of expanding your military kind of operations and your work you're doing there, or do you think you will sort of realign and kind of retarget the public space or private?
That's an interesting question. Military-wise, would definitely head along with that side. It's a very interesting field to work in, especially with upholding the sovereignty of the EU now, current geopolitical tensions and whatnot. So it's another worthy cause to look into and for me to do. So we're definitely going to keep at it with the military stuff. On the other hand, you know, we are still a company. We still very much have our capitalist endeavors. So, you know, we do want to make a lot of money with this eventually. So that's on that end, we're still going to look at targeting the private sector. So I'm currently busy refining our messaging a little bit, slowly starting to reach out to people, seeing what the feedback is and stuff like that. We've just onboarded 2 brilliant go-to-market guys. One's more salesy, the other guy's more of a marketer. So, you know, they're helping me a lot, just refining stuff, you know, pinpointing where we can serve, what we can do and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of a dual-pronged approach at this point.
And I think having that kind of core, you know, that bedrock, the more stable, the longer contracts associated with the public sector, you know, the military, where you're kind of firmly embedded, it's probably good for the long-term sort of stability. You know, in the private sector, it's going to be probably more volatile. It's going to be more, you know, essentially sort of volatile. But if you want to really kind of grow this, and as you said, pursue those kind of capitalist endeavors, which is sort of natural in an entrepreneurial field, that multi-pronged or that dual-pronged approach is definitely, I guess, the sensible way forward.
Yeah, I think so too. But like I said, it does come with its own turmoil though. So private sector is heavily congested, lots of buzzwords and everything. So it's tough navigating the entire ecosystem at this point, particularly in cyber. So like I mentioned, it's nuanced. I kind of equate. It's funny actually when you look into this stuff. So a lot of VCs, for example, to aspiring entrepreneurs would actually recommend B2B startups as it's easier generally than B2C. I don't think that's a completely honest approach or truthful approach, because in B2B, there are silos that are a lot harder, cyber being one of them. It's, legal tech and stuff would probably be in the same boat. The reason being it's not as hype driven. It's not as low effort to adopt for the practitioners in the space. So that's just something that I'd be on the lookout for if, any aspiring entrepreneurs are looking into the space or looking to build something. Just make sure that you know what you're getting into.
And following that theme, are there any other kind of key trends or piece of advice you would give to aspiring or kind of early stage entrepreneurs based on the kind of the lessons you've learned?
Ooh, that's a good one. So honestly, I don't have that much advice to give beyond just making sure to know what you're getting into for these specific sectors and industries you're targeting. One thing that I would mention is that it is becoming an issue to actually get attention online due to the fact of AI and stuff. So there's tons of AI messages floating about. I think we mentioned this earlier. There's tons of spam about. So it's hard getting attention for stuff. The only way that I think you would actually combat this at the end of the day is just pure resilience. So you have to be willing to stick a lot longer in whatever you choose to build, for the reason it's just so easy for places just to upend operations and do something new. So I haven't seen data around this, but I think if there's somebody who would actually to do the effort and plot the time it takes for the average Y Combinator startup to fold operations for the founders just to try something new, I think it's going to be a lot shorter now than what it used to be, purely for the fact that it's never been easier to build something. A lot harder to get market attention for it now, though. But so yeah, the only solution to that is just staying in the market long enough till you figure things out.
I think that's such an interesting kind of perspective. So get good at the messaging, get good at the marketing, and find some way of sort of standing out from the get-go. Any kind of key final takeaways from you? Anything you wanted to leave the listeners with, whether it's a soundbite or anything we didn't cover?
Yeah, you know what? As a short takeaway, focus on identity management. Don't buy the hype cycles. There's going to be a ton of noise in the market right now due to it never being easy to build stuff. So what you have to do is just stick with it, just identify something that would you think reasonably would be able to make an impact for your specific scenario, and just stay in your lane and just keep going. So it's very noisy out there right now. So whatever you do, you just have to stick with it.
Love that. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Ivan. I really enjoyed learning your story, and it's been an inspiring one for sure.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, David. It was very nice speaking with you.